I've created thousands and thousands of jobs. That's what I do.
We're going to create jobs like we've never seen before.
I know everybody. They can't create jobs like me. Nobody's going to be close. We're going to create jobs. I always say I will be the greatest jobs president.
As a candidate, President Trump pledged to create jobs. At the White House, he's struggling to fill them. Red and Blue starts now. Ahead, prosecutors are through with Michael Cohen, but they still have questions about payments for 2 women during the Trump campaign. Plus, turning down a top job, why a rising star in the Trump administration says no to the chief of staff gig and is leaving the White House. And later, Cory Booker makes a weekend trip to New Hampshire as he gets ready to make a decision on 2020. Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. President Trump says his payments to 2 women who claim they had affairs with him more than a decade ago were simple private transactions, and went on to say they were done correctly by a lawyer. The Justice Department accuses Mr. Trump of directing illegal payments to the women during the 2016 presidential campaign. Special counsel Robert Mueller and federal prosecutors released memos last week detailing evidence provided by the president's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen. Cohen says he, quote, acted at the direction of Mr. Trump to buy the alleged mistress's silence. Prosecutors also say that the payments were a possible campaign finance violation, something the president says is wrong. Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff says the president may face the real prospect of jail time.
My takeaway is there's a very real prospect that on the day Donald Trump leaves office, the Justice Department may indict him, that he may be the first president in quite some time to face the real prospect of jail time. We have been discussing the issue of pardons that the president may offer to people or dangle in front of people. The bigger pardon question may come down the road as the next president has to determine whether to pardon Donald Trump.
Joining me now is Miriam Baer. She's a professor of law at Brooklyn Law School and a former assistant U.S. attorney in the criminal division of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. And Rebecca Roiphe is a professor of law at New York Law School and a former assistant district attorney in the New York County District Attorney's Office. Ladies, welcome to you both. A lot to get through. Let me start with you, Miriam. What would a prosecutor need to successfully argue a case that the president violated campaign finance law?
Well, first of all, we'd want to make sure that we're able to prove that those payments that were made to those 2 women, again through intermediaries, was actually connected to the election, right? If it was just simply, I don't want my wife to find out about an affair, then we know that that would not be a campaign violation. So first, that's the first thing we're looking for. And then the second thing we'd be looking for, particularly if you want to prove this as a crime, is you have to show what's called willfulness. And willful is an interesting word in criminal law because it can mean different things. But in this context, we often are looking for evidence that the person understood they were violating the law, or at the very least were doing something wrongful. So usually what you look for are efforts to cover up what you're doing, because if you're covering up what you're doing, then obviously you're aware you're doing something wrong and violating the law. So those are the things you'd look for. Now here, if you're looking for conspiracy, which is what we look at when we have more than one person doing the various things, you'd be looked to see if there was an agreement, right? So you don't have to have done all these various things. If you agreed that someone else would, for example, pay someone, that's perfectly fine to prove that you were part of the illicit agreement.
Based on what we know, Rebecca, do we have a sense of how strong that kind of case might be?
I think that our sense of how strong it is just got stronger because now we have the Department of Justice actually saying that Michael Cohen acted at the direction of the president, not just Michael Cohen saying that. So I think this case got much stronger. Still, he could argue the defenses that Miriam suggested, but I think it suggests that the Department of Justice has some information that we don't know about regarding his intent and regarding the purpose of those payments.
Well, I want to play what former FBI Director James Comey had to say in a Q&A session on Sunday. Let's listen to that.
Is the President of the United States right now an unindicted co-conspirator?
I don't know. Not in the formal sense that he's been named in an indictment where you can actually say that this defendant and named others or others by pseudonym conspired together, and that's how you formally name someone as an unindicted co-conspirator. but if he's not there, he's certainly close, given the language in the indictment, in the filing, that the crimes are committed at his direction.
So what is your thought on that, Miriam? Do you agree with Comey's assessment there? And what exactly is a conspirator, co-conspirator?
So first of all, what Comey is referring to is the fact that Mr. Trump is referred to as individual one. He's not referred to in the filing as CC1 or co-conspirator one. So it's possible to do that, and that's what he's pointing out is one could have done that, one decided not to, one decided to play it safe and call him individual one. That doesn't mean, however, that the prosecutors don't consider him to be a co-conspirator or aren't at some point planning to call him a co-conspirator. There's no reason you have to come right out right now and say it, and in fact there might be good reasons you don't want to come right out and say it. And again, to point out who is a co-conspirator, usually for purposes of federal law, we simply are looking for agreement. You know, you agreed that a particular crime would be committed. You absolutely don't have to have committed all aspects of the crime. It is sufficient that you agreed.
What about, Rebecca, Michael Cohen's credibility here? Because, of course, the allegations are coming from him, somebody whom the president's legal teams tried to paint as a liar, basically. I wonder what prosecutors would do if they felt as though there was a credibility issue. I imagine they would not have gone forward unless they felt as though they had additional evidence to support the allegations he's making.
Yeah, Michael Cohen is a really terrible witness. I mean, prosecutors are used to using really terrible witnesses, but he's particularly bad, and that's why I think to have come out and said this on their own in a document to the court, that they really have some other evidence to suggest that that's so.
And, you know, the president himself is calling these payments a quote-unquote simple transaction, Miriam. Does that hold up as a legal defense here?
That's not going to hold up if there's, and there already seems to be evidence in the form of Mr. Cohen's own plea, and not only that, just the sort of factual scenario in which these payments occurred. The more that these payments appear to have something to do with the election, and they clearly, you know, this is the timing of the payments, the way in which the payments were made, the way in which the payments were covered up, or at least like the reimbursement seems to have been covered up. All of that is going to undermine a claim that, well, this is just a simple payment. I had some women accusing me of an affair, and I wanted this to go away.
Well, what about President Trump's argument, Rebecca, that his lawyer, Michael Cohen, is liable if he made a mistake, not the president? Does that hold up?
You know, I think any one of these suggestions, you know, is possible defense. I think the problem here is that President Trump is not acting like an innocent person. Innocent people tend to take one particular tack, and that's their one story, and they tend to stick to it. They tend to be very open with cooperating with prosecutors, and he has not acted that way, and it's become increasingly true. And I think every time he backs up and changes his story, it's sort of an indication that something is off.
I want to ask about, we only have about a minute left, but I'm curious what you both think about Congressman Adam Schiff's comments. He says the president could be the first in a long time to face the real prospect of jail time. What are your thoughts on that, Miriam?
So there are 2 points to make here. First of all, it seems unlikely that we would see an indictment of a sitting president. And so there are 2 ways in which we could see an indictment of Mr. Trump. One way is if he were impeached, then obviously he would no longer be president. And there could be a possibility that as soon as that impeachment occurred, if he, for example, stepped down or if he was actually impeached, then we would see an indictment. Alternatively, you know, the statute of limitations won't necessarily run on many of these crimes for 5 years from whenever they were complete. And in fact, to the extent you have ongoing obstruction, those crimes haven't run until, you know, to the extent it's a continuing offense. So in that sense, if he were voted, you know, if there were no impeachment, but Mr. Trump were voted out of office in 2020, again, putting aside the potential pardon by another president, there's nothing that says that the prosecutors couldn't simply wait, and then as soon as Mr. Trump was no longer president, they could indict him if the statute of limitations had not run.
So, Rebecca, it sounds like the possibility does exist for the president to be indicted if, in fact, you know, if you think about all those factors that were just laid out there by Miriam, they proceed after the president leaves office.
That's right. I mean, I think right now one's eyes should be on impeachment, though. I think that the political process is the process that really is going to work here. I mean, maybe he'll be indicted, maybe he won't be indicted, but the facts are, especially the obstruction case, is looking stronger and stronger. And that may lead, even if it doesn't lead to criminal charges, may lead to impeachment.
All right, Miriam Beer and Rebecca Roife, thank you both for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Members of Congress are dealing with the fallout from these memos in different ways. Earlier, we heard Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff talk about potential jail time for the president. On the other hand, Republican Senator Rand Paul tried to defend Mr. Trump.
It's very troubling what these special prosecutors can do. And I tell people this. If a special prosecutor went after your life for the last 40 years, not you in particular, but anybody, I think they could dredge up accusations. So I'm absolutely against it. I think it's a miscarriage of justice, and we should not have special prosecutors going after one person. And if we get this way, and if we're going to prosecute people and put them in jail for campaign finance violations, we're going to become a banana republic, where they have every president gets prosecuted and everybody gets thrown in jail when they're done with office.
Let's bring in Ryan Grimm and Shannon Pettypiece. Ryan is D.C. Bureau Chief for The Intercept, and Shannon is White House correspondent for Bloomberg. Thanks to you both for joining us. Let me start with you, Shannon. Does it appear as though these revelations are taking a toll on the president politically?
Well, I think those responses from Congress were a pretty good indication that, for the most part, Republicans are standing by him. And as much as it's great to hear the opinions and legal analysis from lawyers, unless there is a decision by the Justice Department to indict a sitting president, this is probably going to be a political decision that happens. And of course, we have Democrats moving into the House. Many of them have indicated that they would like to see the president impeached with this campaign finance violation. They finally have something they could potentially use, a quote-unquote high crimes and misdemeanor, to impeach him. But Republicans in the Senate show no signs of breaking ranks. And even though Democrats did well in these midterms, there are still many Republicans who broke ranks with the president who are no longer there. So the Republican Party is still standing behind the president.
So on this idea of impeachment, Ryan, independent senator from Maine, Angus King, who caucuses with the Democrats, said he didn't think Congress should open an impeachment inquiry. Here's some of what he said.
Impeachment, essentially, Chuck, is a political issue, and I don't think that well, let me put it this way. I don't think that there's evidence yet available to the public where there would be more or less a consensus that this was an appropriate path. My concern is that if impeachment is moved forward on the evidence that we have now, at least a third of the country would think it was just political revenge and a coup against the president. That wouldn't serve us well at all. The best way to solve a problem like this, to me, is elections.
So, Ryan, are there many Democrats who are hoping to push for impeachment in 2019?
Well, the line that he was putting out there is one that a lot of Democrats have, which doesn't necessarily take it, as he did at the end, all the way to the next election, but it says let the Mueller investigation conclude, and once the Mueller report is out, then there may be evidence in front of the American public that erodes that third down to 15% that say that what he did was acceptable. But a lot of those Democrats kind of want to wait for the Mueller report so that you get closer and closer into the 2020 elections, so that people just kind of say, well, you know what, maybe it's too late to impeach at this point. Let's just go ahead and have this election and throw him out. Democrats, if it's early 2020 and are facing a president that has a 30% approval rating but has enough approval within the Republican Party that he can win the nomination, would probably rather have that than kind of pick from a hat a different president for the next year. Because,
Ryan, what are some of the other factors that people on the left are weighing when it comes to this idea of impeachment?
I mean, mostly it's power for Democrats. For some of them, it might be about enforcing rule of law, and depending on what Mueller finds, then there may be enough enough there to push House Democrats over the top. If they believe that the politics are in their favor, and then they impeach in the House, move it over to the Senate, and put pressure on Republicans to act or not act, they may find that to be a political winner.
Well, while all this is happening, President Trump is trying to fill some key roles in his administration, including Chief of Staff. Vice President Mike Pence's Chief of Staff, Nick Ayers, had been a top contender, but he's also leaving the administration. And sources tell CBS News that President Trump wanted Ayers to commit to serving for at least 2 years, but that Ayers declined. Why would someone decline to serve in that position at this point, Shannon?
Well, I mean, there is an argument that people are making that Ayers wanted to move back to Georgia. He has been planning to move back to Georgia at the end of the year with his family. He has 3 children under 6 years old. Some people have speculated for a while that he could have a future in Georgia politics. That's his home state. So there's certainly a case to be made that this was best for him, for his future, and for his family. However, most people also know that the Chief of Staff job is a really difficult, grueling job. I mean, we saw, Reince Priebus, where the factions and the infighting and the chaos were something he wasn't able to control. And even though Kelly really brought an end to a lot of those factions and infighting, it still took an enormous toll on him. He often would say this was the hardest job he had ever had, and that he was only doing it out of a sense of duty to the country. So if you don't have that type of motivation like a 4-star Marine general has to serve his country, it is a tough job to take.
And what about the time frame here, Shannon? Is a Chief of Staff's job in the White House different in the second 2 years of a presidential term compared to the first 2?
Well, I mean, these are going to be a real pivotal 2 years for this presidency. You have, as we've been talking about, Democrats coming into the House. They will have the majority. Not only will they have the possibility of considering impeachment, but just the investigations they'll be able to conduct and the domestic agenda they'll be able to push back against on things like the budget or immigration. You also have, of course, the Mueller investigation. And then you have the re-election. And there's a number of people in the White House who are already starting to look towards 2020. So it is going to be a really crucial time. And one of the cases that President Trump had made to people about wanting to make a switch from Kelly was that he felt like he wanted someone more politically savvy in that position. And for all of General Kelly's strengths, he really wasn't that politically sharp like you would find in someone like Nick Ayers, who has spent his whole career as a political operative.
So President Trump, Ryan, is meeting with Democratic leaders Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer on Tuesday to see if they can cut a deal to keep the government open. Has there been any movement on that front recently, or has it stalled?
Not much. And this meeting is a good example of why somebody like Nick Ayers would turn this job down. Yes, it is absolutely a difficult job, but for an operative, it's an absolute dream job. This is the pinnacle of a political career. And so while it might be true that some Republicans are publicly standing by Trump, the fact that somebody like Ayers would turn down the absolute political operative dream job and say no thank you shows how much how much things are collapsing for this administration. And now he's staring down a government shutdown of his own making, meeting with Schumer and Pelosi to try to get funding for the wall, which he consistently for a year on the campaign trail said that Mexico was going to fund. It was a call and response with his crowd. Who's going to fund the wall? Mexico. And now he's going to shut down the American government to pay for this wall after this historic rout, the biggest routs in a midterm since 1974. That shows the difficulty that somebody like Ayers was up against in trying to grapple with somebody who thinks that he has his finger on the pulse of American politics, but he has his pulse actually on a shrinking number of core Republican voters.
Let me ask you, Ryan, about Nancy Pelosi. She's reportedly discussing imposing term limits on leadership in the Democratic Party. Does that potential deal seem like it'd be enough to get some of her detractors' support in her push to become Speaker?
I think she probably feels comfortable enough at this point that she's going to win the floor vote. Because I don't know if this is the kind of move that actually helps her, because this would hurt her with a number of senior Democrats, particularly in the CBC, who oppose this move. And it also comes across as a little bit too little, too late, and also deflecting the problem onto future Democratic leaders rather than on herself. So in some ways, I would read this as a signal that she feels comfortable that she's going to have the votes on the floor.
All right, Ryan Grimm and Shannon Pettypiece, stand by. We've got more to talk about. Coming up, Senator Cory Booker visits an early primary state as his 2020 decision nears. We'll show you where potential presidential candidates are generating buzz. Plus, more than a month after the midterms, one House race has yet to be certified amid fraud allegations. We'll have the latest from North Carolina's 9th District, where a new election could be next. This is Red and Blue. 2019 is just 3 weeks away, which means many Democrats are thinking more deeply about 2020. New Jersey Senator Cory Booker was in New Hampshire this weekend and said the visit leaves him, quote, a lot more confident in making decisions going forward. And former West Virginia State Senator Richard Ojeda, who already says he's running in 2020, was in Iowa Monday. Several others have yet to officially join the race. Let's bring back Ryan Grimm and Shannon Pettypiece. All right, last week we saw 2 potential candidates drop out of the 2020 race. There is still a constant stream of visits to early primary states from others. Ryan, when will we see more Democrats come out and officially say they're running?
I think in a matter of weeks. I think you're starting to see people, like Cory Booker, not waiting until the midterms to even start visiting some of the early states. And once you start seeing some of the major candidates announce that they're officially running, then there's going to be an enormous amount of pressure on the others, and I expect that to start extremely soon.
Well, are states like Iowa and New Hampshire, Shannon, still important targets for candidates?
Yeah, they are. I mean, this weird system of Iowa and New Hampshire being first in the nation, and the year plus that some candidates spend laying the groundwork there. Yeah, that's still going to continue this year. It's still kind of continued. It's not always accurate, but it's still really kind of continued to be a bellwether and a way for candidates to really sort of, test things out, to test their ground operation. So, yeah, all of us reporters are expecting a long haul and many winters still in Iowa and New Hampshire.
Long political tradition. All right, Ryan, what other states are emerging, though, as crucial ones for people planning on running for president?
Well, the one that's the biggest change from the past, or the two, are Texas and California, both of which are going to be on Super Tuesday, which will be early March of 2020, but they all have long histories of early voting. And so candidates and campaigns are going to have to treat both of those massive states as if they are early states. It used to be that you invest in the early states and you build your name recognition and your momentum that way, and that carries you into these bigger states. But they're going to have to go into these bigger states cold, and in order to do that, you're going to have either a ton of money, or you're going to have a huge on-the-ground organizing network. And it's an advantage to people like Bernie Sanders and Beto O'Rourke. And I think people are not accurately kind of absorbing how important California could be to Bernie Sanders, somebody who has the name recognition, has the activist base on the ground in California. And if Beto is in, that complicates the picture in Texas for Sanders. But even if he loses some of those early races, if you see him dominate in the big ones, that really does shake the race up.
Well, Shannon, what about President Trump? I mean, it seems like he never stopped campaigning. We saw him out during the midterm elections. Is he targeting some of these early voting states?
Yeah, absolutely. Expect the Trump campaign to really start ramping up staffing. I mean, they've already been adding some staffing, but to actually have people on the ground in Iowa and New Hampshire by the spring, they have raised an enormous amount of money. They have a pretty well-organized campaign, especially compared to the type of campaign organization they had last time around. So while you have Democrats who aren't even really in the starting gate, you have a president who has a very large war chest, who has a campaign organization, who has been building this campaign infrastructure for 2 additional years. And I know that's sort of always the benefit that the incumbent has, but in the past, a lot of times we've seen candidates who had a lot more of a political machine or establishment behind them, Hillary Clinton being a great example of that. And so we have a lot of Democrats here who are starting from scratch, going against a very well-funded, well-organized candidate in President Trump.
It's going to be so fascinating to watch. Ryan Grimm and Shannon Pettypiece, thanks to you both. Really appreciate it.
You got it.
It has been more than a month since the midterms, but there's still one race that looks far from over. In North Carolina's 9th congressional district, Republican Mark Harris led Democrat Dan McCready by just over 900 votes. But the results of the race have yet to be certified. That's because mail-in absentee ballots in 2 counties have been called into question after allegations that a paid Republican operative collected unused and unsigned ballots from voters. As a result, McCready has renounced his concession and is calling on Harris to explain what he knew and when. And joining me now from Bladen County is Nick Oxner. He is the chief investigative reporter for our Charlotte affiliate WBTV. Nick, I know you've been doing a lot of digging on this. Thanks so much for joining us. Much of the coverage has been focused on that paid Republican operative, McCrae Dowless, but you have uncovered evidence of more absentee ballot operations. What have you found?
That's right. Yeah, we found at least what appear to be two other coordinated ballot operations. One, we know because we obtained notes written by a local businessman and city councilman named Jeff Smith outlining a scheme by which people are paid for collecting unsealed absentee ballots. And that third operation, we know, was run by an organization here in Bladen County called the Bladen Improvement Association PAC. We know that they also paid people for what's described on the report as get out the vote efforts, and we know that those people were in turn witnessing and in some cases collecting absentee ballots from voters here in Bladen County as well.
So help us understand, for viewers who have not been following this particular race, what is the problem with collecting absentee ballots from voters directly?
Yeah, so in North Carolina, what's supposed to happen, a voter is supposed to, one, request an absentee ballot. They get it, they fill that ballot out, they sign it, certifying that they've voted, and then it either must be witnessed by one notary who notarizes that ballot and says, yes, I saw the person vote, or it must have signatures from 2 witnesses not notarized. And those witnesses, again, are attesting to, yes, I saw this person cast the ballot, it is who they say they are. And then that person is supposed to mail that ballot in, or they can have an immediate close family member take that ballot to the State Board of Elections or to a polling place. So in North Carolina, no one else outside of the voter or an immediate family member is supposed to take custody of that ballot. So far we have questions surrounding, 1, people who witness those signatures on the ballots, and 2, people like McCrae Dowless, like the Bladen Improvement Association, taking custody of those ballots and submitting them.
Well, you've also reported, Nick, that a criminal investigation into voting irregularities in Bladen County began all the way back in January. So why are we just finding out about it now?
Well, that's really the question that a lot of people are asking. And so there were the similar allegations, the same kind of conduct that were raised in the 2016 election where we had a pretty tight race for governor. The state board referred that matter to state and federal prosecutors. And then we know a second investigation, the one that's currently ongoing, was opened in January of this year. The Wake County District Attorney, who's handling that in place of the district attorney who normally handle matters here in Bladen County, says they've been steadily working with the help of the State Bureau of Investigation, but there's not really been a whole lot of explanation as to why more overt steps hadn't been taken sooner like we see now.
So Mark Harris, the Republican leading currently in this race, has said he is open to a new election but needs to see proof that illegal activity changed the results. Now that's his view, but what would the state need to see before calling for a new election?
So the line that the State Board of Elections, the State Board Chairman, and the staff keeps pointing to is a part of the state law that says you can order a new election if there's sufficient taint. It's basically if enough doubt is created about the validity of the election results.
Isn't that in the eye of the beholder? Taint?
Well, in this case, it's in the eye of the 9 members of the North Carolina State Board of Elections, quite frankly. And so I think that's what you see investigators on the ground doing, trying to gather evidence to show is there or isn't there enough.
So based on what we know now, Nick, how likely is it that we will see a new election?
Yeah, most political prognosticators here in North Carolina, most experts are saying they would expect a new election. That new election probably could come as early as March, but certainly probably more likely in May. We'll know more after an evidentiary hearing is held either later this week or sometime next week.
And does a special election, Nick, tend to help one party over the other?
This is a special case, right?
Yeah.
Because here you have a candidate who's definitely tied to one guy who's been labeled a bad actor, for better or for worse, and we have a lot more facts to come. So I'm not sure that this is going to be any usual special election.
Yeah, right.
Hard to kind of make
Can't
a prediction
compare it,
in this
yeah.
case.
Understood. Intriguing
Yeah, that's
times
right.
there in North Carolina. Nick Oxner, thank you so much for helping to break all of that down for us.
Thanks for having me.
Still ahead, Republican lawmakers in Michigan are working to limit the power of elected Democrats in their state. Details on their efforts when we return. You're streaming Red and Blue. Republicans in Michigan's legislature are trying to limit the power of the incoming governor, secretary of state, and attorney general. All are Democrats who will be sworn in next month. The state Senate last week passed a bill weakening the Secretary of State's power to oversee campaign finance issues. This week, measures aimed at the governor and attorney general are expected to be voted on. These moves mirror efforts by Republican lawmakers in Wisconsin. Kathy Gray joins us from Detroit. She is political reporter for the Detroit Free Press. Kathy, thanks so much for joining us. Explain for us what these measures would accomplish.
Well, there are two measures out there. One would specifically take away campaign finance enforcement authority away from the Secretary of State, and the other one would allow the Senate and House to intervene in any case that is brought before the state. And that is an effort to perhaps undermine the authority of the Attorney General and the Governor, who might take positions in lawsuits that are filed against the state that vary from what the legislature feels about them.
And is there precedent for what we're seeing in Michigan? It sounds an awful lot like what we saw in Wisconsin, but has this happened before in the state of Michigan?
There was an attempt back in, I think it was around 2002, to take some authority away from Jennifer Granholm, who was the incoming Attorney General, and she was a Democrat, and there was an attempt to take away some of her power that failed. Now this one, they're probably going to get through the legislature because they're both held by Republicans that are in the majority, and then it would be up to Governor Rick Snyder to determine whether he's going to sign the bills or not.
So, Kathy, are there any major differences between what's happening in Michigan and the efforts that we've seen in Wisconsin?
Yeah, there's one big difference. Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin is really kind of a political animal, and Governor Rick Snyder in Michigan is not. He has vetoed some very controversial bills that the Republicans have passed regarding gun control and abortion. He has vetoed the Republican bills. And so there is some real hope from the Democrats that he might do the same with some of these bills, too.
And how are Democrats and those opposed to this fighting back?
Well, there have been lots of protests at the Capitol in the past couple of weeks. I expect that there will be more in the coming up 2 weeks towards the end of the legislative session. And I'm sure that if these pass and are signed by Governor Snyder, that there will certainly be court challenges against many of these bills.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Could these measures face any legal challenges? It sounds like there are already perhaps plans in the works.
Absolutely. I mean, it would definitely, with the with the court cases bill, there is an argument there that they are taking authority away from the judicial branch, which is obviously a separate branch of government from the legislature. So there will be some arguments on that case. Again, taking away power from the Secretary of State to enforce campaign finance laws, those are certainly going to be challenged as well by the Democrats.
Well, if these measures pass, is there any sense that there's some concern among some Republicans that they could pay a political price for this?
Well, absolutely. Not only could they pay a political price in 2020 when the next election comes around, because all three statewide offices were won by Democrats fairly handily. And so there could be some backlash at the campaign in 2020, but there also could be some backlash that if they get in power again, that they're going to have to play by these same rules too. So it could end up biting them in the end.
All right, Kathy Gray. Kathy, thanks very much for your insight. Appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Friday marks 6 years since the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in Newtown, Connecticut. 20 children and 6 educators were killed. The group Sandy Hook Promise has been working to prevent gun violence in the years since. They have created a new public service announcement that shows a different perspective on the issue. Here's a part of their PSA.
Your principal speaking. Don't forget, cast your vote today.
All right, come on, guys. Gym class ended 5 minutes ago. Let's go.
Yo, stupid freak!
Look at me!
Joining me now is Nicole Hockley. She's the co-founder and managing director of Sandy Hook Promise, which created that PSA. Nicole's son, Dylan, was 6 years old when he was killed at Sandy Hook. Nicole, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
As we just saw, that PSA is so incredibly powerful. What is it that you hope people take away from it?
I want people to absolutely understand that gun violence is preventable because there are signs and signals given off when someone is at risk of hurting themselves or someone else. We just need to learn how to recognize those signs and then create an intervention.
So this was striking because you put out a press release in which you cite this statistic that 80% of school shooters told someone of their plans prior to a tragedy occurring. Why is it that we don't take these warnings seriously?
Well, a lot of times when we talk to kids out in America, they say when they see these things on social media, they're not taking them seriously because they say if someone's putting it out there, they're not really serious, that they're just seeking attention or drama. We have to teach our kids that if someone's putting it out there, it's a very likely reason that they are actually going to do something, and then they need help, and we need to reach out and help them.
Because I think sometimes people might have the thought that, well, that's just talk, that there's not really necessarily anything that the person is going to actually carry out. And that's not right, you're saying.
Now, we can't say that every time someone puts something out there, like the social media post we just saw in the PSA that says, tomorrow you'll all be sorry. You can't guarantee that that's going to create violence, but it means that someone has something going on in their life that means they need help, and we need to get that intervention and get the person the help that they need.
So the Center for Homeland Defense and Security found 2018 had the highest incidence of K-12 shootings since 1970, which is when records on school shootings began. What progress has been made since Sandy Hook 6 years ago?
Well, we haven't seen any legislative progress, but what we have seen is people getting more and more involved in this issue. We've seen students become alive in the issue after Parkland students have really raised the voice across the country. We've seen more people want to get involved. We've seen, 5.5 million people be trained by Sandy Hook Promise alone in over 10,000 schools, and we've already averted a lot of school shootings and suicide threats. So there is progress being made in terms of education and lives being saved, but we still have a long way to go because people are still dying.
You mentioned the Parkland students. What was your thought when you saw them go out and become so vocal and so active in the immediate aftermath, really, of that shooting?
It broke my heart that they had to do it, but I was very happy that they did, and they push their energy in that direction, because this is about generational change. And if we don't have youth standing up and advocating for themselves, we're not going to get the positive and transformative change that we need.
For people watching right now, what can they do today to try and address this issue and make a difference?
Well, people today can get involved. They don't have to think about this as just a political issue or a legislative issue. They can go to our website, sandyhookpromise.org. They can make the promise. They can bring our no-cost, life-saving violence prevention programs to their schools and districts and be part of the solution in saving lives.
Finally, your organization is called Sandy Hook Promise. What is the specific promise that you are hoping people will actually make?
I want people to promise that this isn't going to be something that's acceptable in the United States, that the fact that this is the biggest year of school gun violence, this is not something that we can continue to have. So promise to be part of the change. Promise that this is not something you're going to let your kids grow up with.
All right, Nicole Hockley, I really thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. We'll be right back. President Trump says he will make a decision on his next chief of staff, quote, soon. The contenders now include North Carolina Congressman Mark Meadows, Office of Management and Budget Director Mick Mulvaney, Acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker, and Wayne Berman, a longtime Republican campaign strategist and the head of global government affairs for the Blackstone Group. Let's bring in Shermichael Singleton. He is a Republican political consultant. Right, Shermichael, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me get your take. What do you think of some of these contenders who are looking to perhaps replace John Kelly as chief of staff, and what are you looking for specifically in the president's pick?
I mean, Mulvaney, he's already said I'm not interested. Treasury Secretary has already said he's not interested. Everyone thought it was going to be Nick Ayers. Even I sort of thought it was going to be Nick Ayers. And Nick Ayers at the last minute said, you know, I don't think I'm quite interested in this position. I think the issue is every single individual that the administration may want to seriously consider is going to look at what happened with the first chief of staff, former RNC chairman. They're going to look at what happened with John Kelly, who's almost on his way out. I mean, this is unprecedented to have two chiefs of staff in essentially 2 years. You're talking one a year. So most people are going to look at that. They're going to look at whether or not the president actually takes advice from his advisors. We know that he does not. And most people are going to say also, if I do accept this role, what will my reputation be once I leave? And so I think most people are going to be hesitant and ultimately say no. But for me, if I was advising the administration, I would probably say you have to think about someone who has that political instinct. Because going into January, Democrats are going to control the House by a large margin. That means oversight, almost continuous oversight. They're going to likely be subpoenaing a lot of individuals who are current and former officials of the administration. You also got to think about what that means for various cabinet secretaries. You got to think about what that means for an agenda. You also have the president gearing up for his own very re-election. So you're going to need someone who understands Washington talk, if you will, as far as how to navigate Capitol Hill, but also how you navigate the president through a 2020 election, a re-election rather, and also how you navigate through the Mueller investigation, which is a constant thorn in the side of the administration, and they don't know what revelation is going to be revealed week by week. That's a lot for anybody.
I mean, Shermichael, that sounds like a lot for one person to navigate.
It is.
Is there such a person who exists who could do that? Because you talk about political instincts. Let's just take that portion of it.
Sure.
Right? I mean, what are the kinds of challenges when you look politically with the Democrats taking control of the House and those kinds of issues that are going to have to be navigated by the president?
Well, I mean, first of all, any individual, you're going to have to think of subpoenas continuously, constantly. The Democrats have no mandate to work with this president. Keep in mind, there's about 60% of the country who doesn't approve of Donald Trump, which is why they gave the House over to Democrats in such a large margin. Republicans also saw upper middle class women that have traditionally been a solid base of support for Republicans finally saying, you know, we don't like what's going on, we're going to cross over. So I think as you're thinking about those things, you have to think, how can I run this train on time, which is ultimately the role of a chief of staff, and set an agenda for the president that makes the president look good to the public, and also such an agenda that works for the president as he gears up for re-election. That's going to be impossible, in part because, one, the president isn't very disciplined, and two, the Mueller investigation. And Democrats are going to want to get to the bottom of things that they believe Republicans did not do and were derelict in doing for 2 years.
So on a similar note, how should the Republican Party as a whole handle the investigations into the president and his associates?
I think for Republicans it's going to be difficult because going into 2020 there's about 18 Senate seats or a little more that are up for re-election for Republicans. If this most recent midterm was any indication of how the American people are feeling, that's not a very good sign for Republicans. But at the same time, they have to be very careful because if you separate yourself too quickly from the president, you risk really upsetting that base who you will need to turn out in 2020 to help protect some of those seats. So I think for Mitch McConnell, as he watches this, I think it's going to ultimately depend on what comes out from the Mueller investigation. And if it's bad enough, similar to Richard Nixon, then that could give Republicans a protection they need to say we have to start distancing ourselves from this president.
So in light of the ongoing investigations and legal issues involving former Trump associates, Washington Post opinion writer Jennifer Rubin says a primary challenge to President Trump is, quote, essential. What do you think about that?
I know Jennifer very well. She's a good friend, and I think she was extremely accurate in her most recent column. I mean, if you remember Ross Perot, and I believe, what, 91, he really was a thorn in the side of George H.W. Bush, and a lot of historians at the time, and even now in political operatives, say that it's because of him, not just Bush's increase in taxes, as we know, but it was because of Perot that ultimately handed the election over to Bill Clinton. The objective for a Republican, maybe it's a Kasich, maybe it's a Flake, the objective wouldn't be to ultimately win the nomination to become the party's nominee. The objective would be to pull enough votes away from the president, almost guaranteeing a victory from the Democrat. But the issue with that is you have to be able to raise the money. And I don't think Flake or Kasich will be able to pull enough Republican money support from those big donors to be able to do that effectively. So that would ultimately come down to someone who likely has enough wealth themselves to be able to sort of build that independent run.
Is there anyone that comes to mind?
I would argue maybe a Mike Bloomberg, for example. I think he's someone who, granted he's a Democrat, but has that business background that could pull away some more center-leaning Republicans, some independents who might traditionally be Republican-leaning voters who may say, you know, I think I'm going to go with this guy, which would really be difficult for Donald Trump. And one other caveat, let's keep in mind, Republicans barely won in Florida. Let's think about Wisconsin. Let's think about Michigan. Those are states that a Republican such as Donald Trump would absolutely need in order to win re-election again. And the fact that we lost Wisconsin, we didn't do well in Michigan, and the fact that Florida was so close, to me as a political operative, I am thinking this means trouble ahead for Donald Trump and also trouble for the Republican Party.
Let me ask you about a policy measure. A growing number of Republican lawmakers are supporting a criminal reform bill that is backed by President Trump. Okay, before you say anything, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has yet to schedule a vote despite calls from the president to do so. How critical is it for Republicans to go ahead and pass this before the end of the year?
If they don't, they won't be able to pass it. And I think when you think about the demographic shifts in this country, this is going to be a huge mistake for the Republican Party. The Republican Party is a party that has traditionally failed with targeting and outreach not only African Americans but also Hispanic Americans as of late. And I think this could have been the proper opportunity to showcase that the party does understand and get some of their critiques coming from these communities, particularly African Americans. And so I think by not doing this, what it does is in the minds of many of those constituents say this is what we already believe. The Republican Party is a party that does not only care about issues that impact us, but they are a party that many believe are a racist party. And many will point to the party's unwillingness to move forward with this piece of legislation, which I think is a catastrophic mistake.
All right, we're running out of time here, but let me ask you, heading into the new legislative year, what do you think should be the top priorities for congressional Republicans?
I think if they can, one of the best things to focus on would be infrastructure. I think that is something that should be able to get bipartisan support from Democrats because it's something that improves the economy. It sort of uplifts all people, if you will. It creates jobs. I think you would see a lot of public-private partnerships coming from such a policy position and program.
All right, as the president says, we shall see. All right, Sure Michael Singleton, really nice to meet you. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks so much.
That does it for this edition of Red and Blue. We'll see you back here on Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern. More news after the break. You're streaming CBSN.